On this episode of 2036, the podcast, how does debate inform deliberation?
A good debater brings the best research to bear on the conversation. A good debater has an understanding of what the opposition, the other side, thinks about the issues. A good debater has the capacity to listen, analyze, and reflect on what's going on in a very quick, rapid exchange. And that's what are things that we need when we talk about deliberation. When we talk about deliberation, what we're talking about is how do we create an opportunity where people who have differing perspectives can get together and then come up with a third space, a third idea that moves us forward together. And when both parties are bringing good research, a commitment to listen, and the capacity to articulate those things, and a willingness to compromise and negotiate, that's when you have an outstanding model of deliberation.
Welcome to 2036, the podcast, Season 3. I'm Ken Carter, and I'm here today with Dr. Ed Lee III. Dr. Ed Lee is the Senior Director of Inclusivity for Emory College of Arts and Sciences and the Senior Director of the Alban W. Barkley Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue at Emory University. He's a sought-after trainer and facilitator for workplaces and organizations seeking to improve communication, collaboration, and cultural awareness. Lee is also a frequent commentator for U.S. presidential debates on both national and local media outlets. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you wear a lot of hats. So let's talk a little bit about your role as Senior Director for Inclusivity for Emory College of Arts and Sciences, where you work with academic chairs to develop and implement programming and discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, in our current political climate, DEI has become a target for some groups. So how are you navigating some of the perceptions of DEI programs?
It's interesting that you use hats as a reference point here, because if you see me on the campus, you'll either catch me wearing an old Negro League baseball cap or a cap from a minor league baseball team. And so you're right, both literally and figuratively. I tend to wear a lot of caps around the campus. And part of my core objective in the work that I do in the college is really helping department chairs who are in some difficult situations with lots of different colleagues doing amazing work, but having different ways that they show up, figure out how to turn those individuals into a collective that's interested in moving the department forward. And so I work very closely with the department chairs in thinking about the culture and communication patterns. Some of that is work that's triage, like dealing with the immediate moment of things that have sort of metastasized and blown up and sort of disrupted. But we also do a lot of proactive work around how do we make sure that we're really instituting policies, practices, and procedures that can help the organization thrive. I know that we are really at this difficult and challenging moment where, particularly in the South, that when we talk about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's viewed as sort of a zero-sum way of thinking about the world in opposition to a collection of people. But the work that I do really shows up from a different place. My origins and background is in debate and in communication. And I am one who strongly believes that if you're going to be an effective communicator, you need to understand your audience. And an important part of your audience are their values, how they identify, what they find important. And so in order for me to be an effective communicator, whether we're talking about with department chairs or talking about in my communities, helping them organize the larger community, I need to understand who's in the audience. And that includes gender, race, class, and the various other values that are showing up. So my work has always been about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It just so happens I've landed in the college where that tends to be a focal point.
And I want to hear all about your work with the Barkley Forum. So how does debate inform deliberation?
let me start off by explaining just a little bit of the origins of the Barclay Forum, that it started on the Oxford campus about 180 years ago with the Phi Gamma Literary Society, with some students who thought that, I don't want to spend just my time in the classroom. I want to get together with my colleagues and talk about the salient issues of the day, and that they would do this outside of the confines of the academic curriculum, but they would really engage in these really tough debates, these really tussles of different ideas in order to move their thoughts and test their ideas. When we moved on to the Atlanta campus, Nolan A. Goodyear became the first director of debate and was really a Methodist minister, but thought that these questions of debating and debating the Gospels and debating the way in which religion informs our lives was an important part of what we needed to be doing to train students. And so the question of debate now, how do we pit students against each other and ideas against each other, where they see debate not as an agonistic model, but really a dance of ideas, and both parties have a responsibility to offering the best support for competing ideas. So you asked the question of how does debate inform deliberation, but a good debater brings the best research to bear on the conversation. A good debater has an understanding of what the opposition, the other side, thinks about the issues. A good debater has the capacity to listen, analyze, and reflect on what's going on in a very quick, rapid exchange. And that's what are things that we need when we talk about deliberation. When we talk about deliberation, what we're talking about is how do we create an opportunity where people who have differing perspectives can get together and then come up with a third space, a third idea that moves us forward together. And when both parties are bringing good research, a commitment to listen, and the capacity to articulate those things, and a willingness to compromise and negotiate, that's when you have an outstanding model of deliberation.
Yeah, so you sort of described debate as a practice that individuals can learn about over time. So how can people who are not involved in debate develop some of those practices?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct that we think of it as a practice, that we are not interested in indoctrinating students with a particular mode of thought or way of thinking about issues. When we talk to our colleagues on the campus about what we do, we're quick to say that we're really agnostic on what the students are talking about and what they're learning. What we want them to do is to learn a mode of inquiry, a mode of engagement that can take place in all the knowledge domains that we support on our campus. So what are the things that we can help other people do or break those down into particular skill sets? One is a commitment to logos, a commitment to logic-based, research-based inquiry. If I wanted to take us back to antiquity and nerd out a little bit with you,
please.
that we would talk about Aristotle, and Aristotle's notions of a good person speaking well would have an ethos, really a commitment to being a credible and ethical speaker. Aristotle would say that you want to have a little pathos with you, that you want to exude a sense of passion about what you're saying, but it's also vitally important that you have that third leg, which is logos, logic, research, rationality. And what we try to do in the models of debate that we have is to focus on the research, because there are some significant downsides when we start to privilege credibility over logos. There are some significant downsides when we start to privilege emotion and passion over research and logic. So what we try to do is to train students to leverage research, err on the side of research when they think about what choices they will make in the immediacy of their lives, but even what policies that they will have. I think most importantly, a practice that people can engage in is that our students take the risk of sharing their ideas in a space where they know they're going to be challenged. They are fully aware that the job of the opposition is to tell them that they're wrong. They are fully aware that at a debate tournament, only one team wins the tournament. So every other team loses their last debate. So they have a sense of understanding and appreciating that failure is an inevitability, and that but there's still a significant value to testing ideas and being open to having their ideas tested.
I mean, a lot of us are sort of used to being in spaces where people mostly agree with what we're saying.
Yeah.
And so you're saying it's practicing being in a space where you know the other individual is not going to be on the same page as you.
Yeah, we exist in mostly ideological, isolated chambers where our echo chambers, if you will, where we know that the people who we're showing up with, our besties, our closest friends, our boos, that these tend to be people who see the world like we do. Unfortunately, most of our country is still primarily segregated in some ways of where our housing stock is. So we tend to sort of have religious and faith experiences with people who look like us and think like us. We tend to roam around communities with people who look and think like us. And the downside risk, and there's a significant one of that, is that we tend to think that those people who are telling us that we're right because they believe that we're right, and I know that I'm right because all of the other people agree with me who I'm talking with, then that sends a signal that I don't have to compromise, that there's nothing that's biased about the way in which I see the world. There's no need for me to offer up an alternative in perspective or even entertain one. And what debate does, an appreciation of that agonistic model of communication where we challenge each other, is that we always understand that there's a different interpretation, a different understanding of how the world operates and functions.
Now, you got involved in debate for the first time in high school. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. My relationship with Emory University goes way back. The first debate I ever saw was in the old Winship Ballroom in the AMUC. We've torn down that part of that building to build the Emory Student Center, and I may be the only person who misses that old wing where the Winship Ballroom was. But I remember as a high school student, the Barkley Forum it supported what was called the Atlanta Urban Debate League. And it supported developing debate teams within the Atlanta public schools. And one summer, we showed up here, and the first debate I ever saw were these Emory students talking about the distribution of renewable energy technology to China. And that technology was converting dung into an energy resource, and they were talking about how that could resolve questions of poverty and help us deal with climate change. And to this day, I remember sitting there thinking, I so want to be able to talk about shit in such a sophisticated way that they are doing. And that was my attraction to debate. I want to sound smart, even when I'm talking about dung.
You may not know this about me, but I'm trained as a psychologist. I teach at Oxford College, and I was in debate in high school as well.
It's amazing.
In fact, I brought my pin from it's probably 40 years old, actually, from long ago. My areas were extemporaneous speaking.
Yes.
I did Lincoln Douglas debate and original oratory. And I feel like it had an impact and really changed my life. It sounds like it did a lot of the same things for you.
Absolutely. That's amazing that the NFL, the National Forensics League,
yes.
It is now the National Speech and Debate Association, which you're fully aware of. And one of the organizations that I work with is the NSDA in helping them think about how do we make sure that the opportunities that were provided to both of us to take the skills of speech and debate and leverage those into outstanding careers, both professionally, but really supporting our communities, becoming thriving places to live, work, and play. And I helped them think about that and how to institute policies. You're correct in that I have no idea where I would be now without debate. It is uncanny every time I walk on the campus and I walk into the Barkley Forum. I mean, the AMUC, there's this line and wall of portraits. And that wall of portraits are the alums of the Barkley Forum. And it goes back to the early 1950s. And that you can see the subtle change of those portraits where there's more women, more folks of color.
Right.
And what I see, and I think of myself as really being the keeper of that wall. And I want to make sure that it is a thriving place where Emory students get to show up and debate and learn the skills that we have been afforded an opportunity to learn, but they also see and embrace an obligation of transferring those skills to other people. And so what Melissa Maxey Wade, who is the former director of debate here at Emory, who was here for 47 years, would say that the way in which the students earned their ticket onto the bus to go to a tournament was to show up to the AUDL tournaments, that you had to give back. You had to be in service to humanity. And one of the ways you did that was with the skills of debate, thinking analytically, understanding that your voice matters, doing that in a way that's highly deliberative, where you invite other people to participate. And so I'm proud to be the keeper of the law, and I love that Emory still trusts me to do that.
Yeah. And so what kinds of spaces do you feel like those skills allow you to be in that you might not have been in before? Or what kinds of benefits do you feel like it can provide people?
Yeah, I'm smiling because when you asked that question, Ken, I immediately thought sitting here and having this conversation with you, there's no way that we're doing this without debate, that there's no way that I have the ability to turn a phrase, to think analytically, to process the questions that you have. And I constantly think about growing up, going to Harper High School here in the Atlanta area. And I think back to my friends who were in high school who have lives that are very different from my own life, which is really about the habits of the mind. I used to tell people that I have the greatest job ever. And check this out. Emory University pays me to go to the library, read books, and then turn those books into arguments that I share with really smart students. And we then go and play this game called debate against other really smart students. Who gets to do that for a living?
Yeah.
And I get to do that because of debate, because there were a series of people who said, here are some skills and opportunities that we want to afford you. And the Barkley Forum, the Atlanta Urban Debate League was at the heart of that, and Emory's commitment to cultivate students, faculty, staff who are in service to humanity was at the heart of that.
So you've been described as a relentless advocate for public debate and dialogue, and you've appeared in national and local media outlets discussing presidential debate strategies. Now, presidential debates have taken a turn in the last couple of years. How can we move towards a more inclusive, fact-based, and even hopeful approach to public discourse?
One of the things that concerns me about the current place that we are with presidential debates is that things are hyper polarized, and it feels like we can't find the most extremist way of talking about politics, regardless of whether you're on the left or the right. It makes it really difficult to find a middle ground where we compromise. I think that we need all of our political candidates who are wedded to the notion that we can come together, talk about our differences, and commit to a process of preserving our democracy. And I think that our debates are one of the few spaces remaining in our politics that does that. People show up, they have a difference of opinion, but they are committed to sharing those opinions and airing them in public. One of the things that you're asking a question about is, well, how do we shift them to a more fact-based model? I think that we want to start with, how do we reinforce a commitment that our politics are public? Our politics have to be a place in which they are open, they are accessible to all, and that we hold our politicians accountable when they try to turn our political space into a private mode of existence, and that has to be a no-go zone. I think that many of us could really do more of committing to having less of our knowledge generated by social media and more of our knowledge generated by folks like you who are professors, who are really engaged in thinking about the long term, thinking about history, thinking about the behaviors and how there are rhythms and in the ways in which we participate. And so how do we learn that and how do we use that in order to make decisions? We are too quick to react, and that we want instantaneous gratification in all ways in which we participate. So how do we slow down and appreciate that real knowledge, real ways of engaging the world that's thoughtful, earnest, and productive is a slow process, and one that requires us to be active participants?
It's almost like the difference between sort of fast food and slow food,
Yes.
right? The fast food is really delicious, easy to get, and it sort of gives you a buzz, but it may not really be good for you. And so turning that into what we're seeing now in social media to a more deliberative kind of thing, it will be hard because it might not be as exciting to see that kind of conversation.
And yeah, I'm hoping that we can get to a place, and I know this will take some work, where our first impulse when we're agitated is not to turn to Twitter or X, if you will, and spout out whatever thing we're thinking about at the moment that's cathartic for us to send this out to the universe. But instead, we think, one, what is it about that human being and their lived experience that got them to that place? And how are those experiences different from my own? And two, I clearly don't know enough about this. Where are the books that I can read? And only after doing those two things do we start to turn to places like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. But I hope if we're doing those two things, then we can find communities, trusted communities of engagement and dialogue in real time, in person, and we don't need to show up into those spaces.
Now, in your work as a trainer and facilitator, how do you help organizations with communication, culture, diversity, and inclusion?
Yeah, one of the things that I think that many organizations are struggling with is that they clearly understand that if you want to maximize the potential of your organizational unit, you need people from different spaces, different places, different ways of thinking about the world. There's one way of thinking about this is that if most of our cities are really quite diverse, they have different people of different faiths, different traditions, different understandings of the world. And I think that our best businesses, our best organizations are described that way as well. But just saying that doesn't mean that we understand or that we can create a welcoming space for all people who are there, or that people feel that they can show up in a way that they want to offer their brilliance. So one of the things that I try to do is to help organizations think about how do they be together, and how do we create the conditions in which we welcome people to share all that they have to offer to each other. Some of that is really as simple as when you're hosting, what kinds of food are you serving? That food is deep and rich. I'm from the South, Ken. So one of the things that I tell people is that one of the ways in which my grandmother showed me love, who raised me, was through her food. And I think that that's not just about being Southerners. That's a lot of people. And yet when you're an organization and you serve food that people can't eat, you're sending a signal that they're not welcome. When you also have an organization where all the doors are closed, you're sending a signal that you don't want to be disturbed, that it's not about the community, it's about the individual. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we create the environment where people want to share and they want to be a part of the organizational unit.
Now, on top of everything else you're doing, you're currently studying interconnections among religion, justice, and peace at the Candler School of Theology. So what led this to an area of study for you, and why is it important to you?
This is something it's there, but it's not very public about the choice that I made to do that. When I finished up my doctorate, I was doing some work on the question of self-authorship. and the role of debate in producing self-authored students. What is it about the model of debate where your ideas are tested and challenged that allows for you to have a better understanding of who you are that may be disconnected from the values that were bestowed upon you when you were being raised as a child? How are you writing your own life script? And what is the role of a model of deliberative engagement where people test those that allows for you to produce that? And I came to the conclusion that debate is really a healthy way of producing that all of these students were really testifying to that. And I got to the place when I finished that, I was like, where is the place that I can go that will test the way in which I think about the world in ways that are new and vibrant and refreshing? And I hadn't been to a church in many years. I'm not a religious person at all, even though I was raised in the church at that moment. And I thought the Candler School of Theology, that it has some of the brightest minds who are there. There are people who are committed to their faith and their religious practices, and that's a place where I can go and have a really engaging conversation about the role of theology in the way in which we think about society, and even in testing me and thinking about some of the ways in which I show up in the world. The other thing that I thought was that religious communities do a fantastic job of some of these notions of creating welcoming spaces, acknowledging people where they are, creating a sense of stickiness in getting people to show up and stay. And I was hoping that I can find some things in those spaces that I could port into the secular spaces that I was existing in.
And has it had an impact on the way you train students around debate? Or has it had an impact on how you're thinking about inclusion and diversity?
Well, I don't know if it's had an impact on the way in which I think about debate. It has had an impact on the way in which I think about dialogue. One of my closest friends now was someone who I met at the Candler School of Theology and taking classes. And this friend considers themselves to be quite orthodox in the way in which they see the world. But the thing that we shared in common was really a love of books and reading books. And so we started this little 2-person book club where we started reading books together. And now once a month we meet and we just talk, and we're no longer sharing that over books, but we get together and it's sort of perspectives of life and where we are. And we're just radically different people, but we have this commitment to share, this commitment to community, and a commitment to have community that goes beyond who we are in the most facile ways in which we think about who we are. And that's what it has done mostly for me, is to help me see that even when we think about these significant differences that we have along the lines of even race or religion, that there is just ample opportunity to find spaces of commonality and opportunities to learn from each other. And I remain committed to doing that.
Now, when you think about all the different things that you've done and things you're doing, what do you feel like is the common thread that runs through it all?
I see communication and community as two sides of the same coin. In fact, if we look at the etymological root of both community and conversation, it's together. And I think the common thread is a commitment to bring people together, to figure out how do we move forward together. That we have some really difficult challenges in the world, that whether or not we're talking about massive political polarization, to climate change, to conflict that's along the lines of religion, to the ways in which we're dealing with aggression in other parts of the world, to the mental health crisis that we're dealing with, that I don't think any of those can be dealt with on an individual basis. That in fact, we do ourselves a disservice by saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, go figure out how you can address this issue on your own. I don't think these are individual challenges. I think that these are challenges of the collective, of the community, and that they require us to find solutions together. And they require us to figure out, how do we bring the best thoughts, the best minds, the best perspectives and create opportunities to meld those together in something that can move us forward. I'm thinking about Franz Johansson's book called The Medici Effect, where he talks really about ultimately, if we look at the Renaissance, it was the production of the bankers, the artisans, the papacy, the architects coming together in Florence, Italy, and really having their knowledge domains bombard against each other that created this amazing artwork and these amazing scientific discoveries. And I think that we need that now to address the really difficult challenges that we have moving forward.
Well, Dr. Lee, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. It's been a really amazing discussion. And thanks for all that you do for helping with the community here at Emory.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about 2036, Emory's campaign to transform the future, visit 2036.emory.edu.